I'd like to explore the resistance to truth that we have as a culture and as a species. And it's very interesting because within a scientific paradigm with which we claim to cling on to and value, knowledge is power. Accurate knowledge is accurate power. The ability to influence something is predicated on the ability to understand where it is, what it is, and how to influence it. In other words, truth is a doorway to power. And it's partly in the context that in the information age, global data has become more valuable than oil, that the most valuable asset in the global economy is actually data, collected often without permission, hidden but sold around from various companies and governments. Data about human beings to influence elections, etc., is the single most valuable asset in the world. It's more valuable than all the world's oil. And in that context, resistance to truth, resistance to information is a stunning corollary pattern. So, like in so many aspects of a schizophrenic culture, we have the most valuable asset, but then we also have these areas where truth is resisted. And this pattern of resisting truth is global and striking. It goes through time, it goes through country, it goes through different sectors of culture, where some of the biggest bringers of new and competently presented information are singled out for attack or resistance of some kind. We see it in the Catholic Church refusing to look through the telescope. So we have the dogma for thousands of years that the sun and everything in the universe goes around the earth, God's creation. And we have the Catholic Church, a dominant power structure, at the time more powerful than science, more powerful than many kings and countries. And rather than celebrate change, we have the death threat of the person that brings in new information. More recently, we have the systemic cover-up of 5% of pedophilic priests, where again, the Catholic Church, the embodiment of all things good and holy, the representatives of the highest deity in the universe, is actually harboring and enabling a higher percentage of child sex molesters than probably any organization on the planet, because 5% of high school teachers don't sexually molest young children. 5% of kindergarten teachers probably don't molest. I mean, it may be 1%, but it would not be surprising if that 5% figure is well above average in a culture that does abuse and molest its children. But again, fighting, silencing, non-disclosure, covering up, denial, etc., of its most central responsibility. Don't be evil, embody your doctrine. And you also see the hypocrisy, of course, because the insular and self-referential behavior that reinforces the power structure at the expense, in the case of hiding from the truth that the earth goes around the sun, you are killing, threatening, excommunicating a scientist for telling the truth that is counter to the dogma. But then when you come to the pedophilic priest scandal, again, with all the various politics involved, you have breaking the core dogma. I mean, I would think that it's pretty close to demonic, evil, satanic within a dogma of the Bible to have priests sexually molesting boys. So for all of the homophobic hatred that the Catholic Church has spread around the world, hating and denying homosexual men the right to be sanctified as sacred, with how important it is to hold on to the dogma. Here you have the opposite, actually protecting, because homosexuality within the church is, with members, no one's asking in the Catholic Church paradigm that homosexual men and homosexual marriage be allowed to molest children. They're asking for consenting adults to be acknowledged as sacred human beings that the love is sacred between two men who consent and actually love each other. But that is banished. But at the same time, the church is involved in a $1 billion cover-up, a systemic cover-up of homosexuality within priests. There is a very high percentage of homosexuality within priests, obviously very schizophrenic. But then one of the highest concentration, I mean, you will not find 5% of engineers sexually molest boys. You will not find 5% of scientists molest boys. You will not find 5% of atheists, molest boys as part of being atheists. But 5% of Catholic priests violate the Bible and are covered up by the Vatican. So you can see there's in this case, in the one case, they're holding on to protect the dogma against change. In the other case, they're violating the dogma, but protecting the power structure, but nonetheless fighting and resisting change. As we go to the U.S. government, the framers of various bills of rights and constitutions, at the time, key figures are writing things like all men, in a chauvinistic paradigm, it's still men, all men are created equal by people who own slaves, who have slaves as they are writing this. So again, an obvious schizophrenia. More recently, one of the greatest threats to national security in the U.S. government has been a young man who pointed out to the American people the gross violations of the Constitution of the United States. Edward Snowden pledged an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, which is the primary doctrine to follow if you are in the U.S. government. However, that is exactly what he has had his passport removed for, why Joe Biden called major governments all around the world and threatened and bullied them not to grant political asylum to a young man who pointed out that his superiors, his government, and his president had systematically violated the U.S. Constitution. That was his duty to report the violation of the central doctrine that someone in government swears to uphold, the U.S. Constitution, not to spy on without a warrant, not to invade people's privacy without a warrant, and that our tax money was spent to violate our various rights and to violate the rights of our allies, to spy on other people, to participate in one of the biggest violations of the U.S. Constitution in recent years. And for this, Edward Snowden was hunted down like an animal by the entire chain of command, the various FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, President Obama, Joe Biden, frantically directing the resources of a country to silence, kill, minimize, dehumanize, take away the rights of an American citizen for upholding their sworn oath to protect the United States by upholding the Constitution from enemies within the United States and without the United States. So we see a tremendous violation of power. We also see the splitting of the country, meaning a large portion of the country had little interest in the violations of the Constitution, had little interest in Edward Snowden upholding his oath, had little interest in the rights being violated, and were largely ignorant of the Constitution, but were angry that Edward Snowden told the truth. We have a clear right of a freedom of the press as a basis of democracy. And if we look at the attacks on communism, particularly in the McCarthy era, where undemocratic, unconstitutional violations of human rights to believe and vote and belong to a communist party were again systematically, for political reasons, careers were lost, families were lost, reputations were lost, as again the U.S. government violated its own constitution to hunt down, humiliate, and bully people who thought there might be something in the communist doctrine that basically said that labor, human beings, is more important than capital. So you have the communist community and capitalist, people that are protecting the rights of money and people who are protecting the rights of human being. A tension, and regardless of pros and cons of each one, and admittedly in any polarity and tension, there are pros and cons of each one, but violating the freedom in a democracy to actually be a part or vote or choose to associate freely with one's friends and have free thinking in a democracy. And so this kind of, and it's so paradoxical that the reason the Russians had to be killed and expelled from the country and all that was to protect our way of life, the democratic way of life. So we have to violate democracy in order to protect democracy and capital. And in that whole, we have a free press, they don't. That's why we have to, violate various principles of our Constitution to protect, the country. And in this dynamic, WikiLeaks emerges as an embarrassment of the global bullying and war crimes of the United States. Because another human being who put Constitution and humanity and what they believed in ahead of protecting the power structure was Chelsea Manning bringing Abu Ghraib, for which she received death threats, received military discipline, death threats, etc. For what? For telling an inconvenient truth. Because it's one thing to go and invade another country and traumatize millions of its people because that's a terrorist country that has weapons of mass destruction that's threatening us. It's one thing to do that under that basis, and we're the righteous and we're the holy. It's another thing to invade a foreign country, to put American lives at risk, to give 1 million Iraqis PTSD, which will systemically perpetuate child abuse for generations, the way all children growing up with a parent with PTSD experience, so that we can participate in the degradation of humanity, the violation of human rights, the perpetuation of terror, shame, and humiliation on a foreign country with trumped-up charges without any legitimacy or evidence, simply because we are a bully who can do so. That is a very different narrative. And to spend $1 trillion of future generations' money. You see, $1 trillion could plant 1 trillion trees. That's how much it costs to plant a tree. $1. $1 trillion could plant 1 trillion trees. So you go to Iraq and torture, humiliate, torment, shame, and abuse millions of Iraqis in a foreign country with $1 trillion of our children's money. Or you have the other alternative, which is to plant 1 trillion trees around the globe, making allies, spreading goodwill, setting an example of responsibility, the ability to respond to an important global crisis as an intelligent adult rather than an abusive parent. You have that choice, 1 trillion trees, or compounding the CO2 emissions, spreading depleted uranium, bullets, blowing things up that will consume more natural resources. Because it's not just $1 trillion of debt that is passed on to the next generation. It is the spending of $1 trillion to destroy natural resources in a careless and haphazard and unnecessary way, be it bridges, be it concrete buildings, that require the expenditure of oil, stone, natural resources, cement, to rebuild what is damaged at the expense of an overtaxed ecology. So we're going to put you in debt under false pretenses to damage the lives of more than 1 million Iraqis and set their children up for childhood abuse. We're going to further destroy the environment, and we're going to give you, the children, the $1 trillion debt. Because that's the kind of fucked up parents that we are. And this is what we do in an abuse society. There's a schizophrenia there. And Julian Assange with WikiLeaks has been eating away with truth some of these things, pointing out the footage of the Reuters journalist mown down by U.S. helicopter gunships, pointing out some of the war crimes here, some of the CIA Vault 7 documents of how the Central Intelligence Agency has been corrupting and eroding the value of U.S. companies such as Apple and Microsoft by spending taxpayer monies to make our technology more vulnerable to hacking, corruption, and digital theft, so that the U.S. government could violate its own constitution and spy not only on its own people, but the world. And this is intolerable to have this truth coming to light. And so WikiLeaks, as one of the most competent journalistic organizations in the world, meaning WikiLeaks has broken most of the biggest stories that no other global organization has brought to light, and has been 100% accurate. And it is one of the most efficient news organizations in the world in terms of the amount, unlike CNN, which will partner to tell the narrative of the abuser. You know, CNN was right over there with Iraq, telling the wrong story. Oh, there's, X number of planes, we're moving ahead. That's not the story. The story is we are traumatizing 1 million Iraqis and generations of their children to tell a lie because we're the global bullies. And we lack the integrity and the ethical framework to understand that you cannot go to war with a feeling. Terror is a feeling. It is not the enemy. It is a symptom of acts of bullying and oppression and abuse of power. Terror is the symptom of bullying, of unregulated violence, of acts of oppression and abuses of power. That is the ally. The feeling is there to tell us you are being bullied. Bullying is not in anyone's interest, not even the bully. Studies show that the bullies suffer as much depression and mental emotional disease as the victims over time. Terror is not the enemy. Abuses of power are the enemy. The United States abused its power to be a global bully at the expense of generations of Iraqi children, while telling lies and breaking its own laws and its own constitution. Julian Assange has been specifically targeted for 7 years in a global bullying dynamic behind closed doors with the United States pressuring countries. Ecuador granted Julian Assange political asylum. So then the British government was pressurized to not let Julian Assange leave the Ecuadorian embassy without being sent to a military tribunal in the United States, who has no interest in the Constitution. They have an interest of silencing truth tellers about abuses of power which create terror. So, and again, you have the split personality. We're going to spend trillions of dollars of our children's money. That's what you do when you go into debt as an irresponsible grown-up or government without the ability to pay for it. The U.S. can't even pay its own debt. We're talking about that level of sociopathic, juvenile behavior. We can't pay our debts. We can't follow our own doctrines. We abuse our power because we can. We hate the truth, and we're doing this for your own good. The abusive parent is a fractal representation of the United States government. The schizophrenia, the abuses of power, the levels of stupidity, the blame, the incoherence, the left hand doing the opposite of what the right hand is doing and nobody's talking to one another, the CIA smuggling in crack cocaine into black neighborhoods, and then with one bit of your tax money, and raising money to send instruments of terror and training terrorist troops for the securement of oil and propping up corrupt, undemocratic governments. Iran-Contra, we're going to raise money illegally for illegal activities that create terror so that we can then go into debt to spend money to try and fix all the rogue organization we train in terrorist tactics, including Osama bin Laden, with more of your children's money. And here's the bill, and we did all this for your own good. Love your country when it is abusing you. Love your parents when they are abusing you. Don't look at the truth. The fractal insanity and reenactment at every level is there. In the projection of the human shadow, where the United States is famous for its projection of evil, the axis of evil, this is evil. The other guys are the bad guys. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys, I would say is the essence of that narrative. And we're going to arm ourselves and become the biggest military, etc., to prove that we're the good guys, because no one will argue with us if we blow them up for the argument. Russia kept many of its treaties that America did not. Russia had more integrity than the United States in many situations. After the removal of Vietnam, of the signing of the peace treaty in Vietnam, the United States did not pay didn't pay up. The treaty required the U.S. to pay several $billion in damages for having set a country on fire. It agreed to pay that as part of its treaty. It didn't own up. It's a deadbeat dad. The United States is a deadbeat dad that doesn't pay its bills and that gives its debts to its children and punishes people for pointing out its cruelty, its sadistic, pathological cruelty to its own people. We have a profound split personality in a profound dance of self-hatred in which the left hand doesn't talk to the right. 100 years ago, women, all men are created equal. This was, of course, meant to include women, but women shouldn't have the right to vote even 100 years ago because, according to some of the arguments, it would waste paper and ballots because women, being women, would, of course, vote the same way as their husbands. So it would just double the number of ballots, but not change the election one bit, because every dutiful wife would vote the same way as their husband. So they are in effect voting when their husbands vote. Today, women are prevented from top positions of leadership in every single major religion. The personification of the divine, the ideal, through the control, through force and violence of men. Women are not allowed, 50% of the population. The more empathic and community-oriented part of the demographic, meaning if you have 100 women in positions of power in a religious organization, you have more empathy and more community focus than if you have 100 men. Statistically speaking, women are biologically oriented towards more empathy and community thinking than men. And so they are excluded from the power structures that they could more competently influence for the stated mission of the organization. If you have an altruistic, community-oriented mission, global religions, put women at the top. If you want better statistical results, if you want better battles fought, put men at the top. Men are statistically more sociopathic than women. And so if the game is a sociopathic game such as war, put men at the top of military organizations. But if the game is the spreading of transcendent truth and vision, put women at the top of those organizations. Now, we have the same schizophrenia. Well, women can't run the country. Women can't run a military organization. They might take pity. You see, a woman might have taken pity on 10 million Iraqi children that are going to develop severe childhood abuse as a result of giving their parents and grandparents PTSD. A woman might have taken pity on those children, one, and heaven forbid, delayed an unnecessary and expensive act of global bullying, aggression, and terror based on lies. She might have done that, and this would be a disaster for the military complex. This isn't going to raise budgets. This is a disaster. So certainly the military doesn't want a woman at the top of the military. Fine, fine. That makes sense. That makes sense. Your budgets for corrupt wars of aggression and the reenactment of trauma and childhood abuse on a global scale would diminish. And your goal is to expand. So fine, do not invite a woman to the table. But the global religions? Would 5% of women have sexually molested young boys and young girls in the Catholic Church? Do facts matter today any more than they did hundreds of years ago when astronomers were being excommunicated for telling the truth? In the United States today, mushroom consumption of psychedelic mushrooms that have been consumed culturally and indigenously for thousands of years around the globe are being viewed as a bigger threat than homelessness. In the United States, where millions of Americans, including 1 in 30 children, who runs away from an abusive family, in a cult that doesn't give its parents a single hour of parental training in high school and is effective at passing on intergenerational abuse. "42% of our homeless have PTSD from being harassed, shamed, and given the message that they do not matter as human beings. Their money matters, which is why they will be treated well if they have money and treated like shit if they do not, and they do not have the money necessary to buy the ever increasing expense of our houses." There are now more than 10,000 separate codes and laws that directly tie to the cost of housing. Every single one of these laws makes it illegal to build a cheaper house. I've built houses in different states and around the country. Every single time I have tried to build a smaller house, I have been prevented and told that that is illegal, that I must build a house to a certain square footage. 600 square feet is not big enough for an individual in any of the places that I've tried to build. It was big enough for me, but it was against the law. No, you have to go to a minimum of 1,200 square foot here. You have to go to a minimum of 900 square foot here. No. You cannot help the environment, help the neighbors, build a smaller house. You cannot do it. Okay, so I've got to build a 900 square foot okay, fine. So we expand the size of the house. By law, a free country, by law. We cut down more trees, by law. We use more natural resources, by law. We run up the heating bills to heat a bigger house, by law. Okay, now that you've expanded every single aspect of natural resources to meet that law, you then run into the other laws. Oh, you can't do that using recycled materials because we want you to engineer. We want you to do a structural analysis of that piece of recycled wood. Oh, your engineer that we require you to use by law will not certify the calculations to show that this bit of recycled material is strong enough for your house? Well, we won't let you use recycled materials. And we won't let you use it. You don't plan to use 6 outlets of electricity in this room, and so you'd like to save money on electricity? Well, it's against the law. We will not give you a permit for your house unless you use the appropriate amount of electricity in your house, by law. You want to use candlelight and not have a house that's off the grid? It is against the law. You want to collect rainwater? That's against the law too. We have 10,000 laws that make it illegal to build a low-cost house. Having outpriced a percentage of the marketplace who cannot afford the houses that are legally built, we then shame and humiliate them and shove them from one illegal position to the other, having provided no legal land. This is fine because we believe in abusing our most vulnerable citizens at multiple layers and shaming them for our incompetency. That's fine. It's fine that in Denmark and Thailand, 2 totally different countries, they can house all their people. I don't see homeless people in Thailand. They make $300-400 a month. I see homeless people in my town. They make an average of $20,000 a month. The median income of a citizen in Marin County, California, is $250,000 a year. The 5th wealthiest county by median income in the country. And we do not have the money to help our homeless. That's saved for countries like Thailand that do not have 1,000 laws that raise the cost of housing. And believe it or not, when any citizen in a country is uninvaded in their right to provide safe, legal housing for themselves and their family, they do it. My neighbor in Thailand just spent $2,000 for an entire family home, and their government did not prevent them from doing so. That home couldn't have been built in my county because 1,000 laws would have jacked up the price to more than $650,000. And our homeless say, I've got $2,000. I don't have $650,000. And the answer in a pathological abuse cult is very well, we will spend $60,000 a year per person to shame you and to traumatize you with our policing, with our park service, running up ER bills, and waking you up in the middle of the night to remind you you're not allowed to sleep in your cars. Pathological abuse, traumatic, abuses of, you name it, that's fine. Because we're the United States. We're number one in childhood abuse, in stupidity, in running up debt, in spending military money to damage the environment that we don't seem to be able to get our hands around responding to. We're number one. Mushroom consumption is so dangerous that we spend $1 million per person to lock up an American citizen for consuming psilocybin mushrooms. Oh, we've got to punish that with a 10-year sentence. Tough on crime. Ignore the family statistics of a disrupted home. Ignore the damage to the economy that we say we're so keen to protect. Traumatize and bully and terrify. The war on terror. Let's terrify more people. Let's have one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world. To violate our own scientific data. To call a medicinal plant a Schedule I drug. Let's just lie. Let's just make stuff up to allow us to spend over $1 trillion. This time we're not fighting an emotion. We're fighting powders. Wars on substances. Feelings of terror are not your enemy. They're a symptom of terrified people being bullied in a sociopathic cult. Powders, plant-based in particular, are not your enemy. They are a symptom of high levels of ignorance, pain, in a traumatically illiterate culture that sadistically and masochistically exposes its most vulnerable people at their most vulnerable time in life, children, to the profound incompetence of their government, parents, and schools, to a level of traumatic overload where addictive, dissociative experiences with alcohol, cigarettes, and opiates are gratefully consumed to avoid the terror that is our cult. But let's blame the substances. Let's have a war on powders rather than a war on ignorance and stupidity within the very power structures that perpetuate intergenerational abuse and trauma. not the least of which is giving tens of thousands of soldiers PTSD in a predictable fashion with trumped-up unnecessary wars, and then dumping them onto families who have no way of dealing with the sociopathic state induced by a terrorist government that gives your fathers and husbands back to you in a state of shame, trauma, and violation, with amnesia, with denial, when we understand, with hundreds of years of research, that we are exposing the children in these families to pathological, sociopathic violations that will give those children and the children of those children PTSD, just like we do in Iraq. In the geological and archaeological domains of science, just like in any area of science, we have dogma. We have a working narrative that has changed endlessly. One could say that science is an art form of inventing narratives that effectively explain the available data of the day, but do not explain everything. There is always anomalous data that doesn't fit the simplicity of a given paradigm. This anomalous data is fought because it exposes us to change. It exposes us to uncertainty. If a leading geologist or archaeologist or scientist in any form has developed a nice theory and new data, and it was a wonderful theory. It allowed us to predict this, and it was so nice to escape the uncertainty, the dread of the unknown. It was so lovely to have, we know what we're doing here, finally, great, don't mess with it. New data comes along. Some of the most stunning data about our Earth's history is being dug up by people like Graham Hancock. So he is shoved out of the archaeological community, fought by the experts, not the public. The public is less threatened with change than the experts, than the archaeologists, who are in a political power dynamic. So he's shoved out. Throughout the narrative of science, the most important breakthroughs are often by people who are ridiculed, marginalized, and excluded from power for much of their lives, until the data becomes overwhelming that the paradigm has to shift. And we can see that with Graham Hancock. We can look more recently with Tesla Motors, the need to shift towards electric, pathologically and irrationally denied by Ford, denied by GM. GM spent money to retrieve its electric car and crush it against the wishes of its owner to maintain its dogma that no one wanted electric cars and they were not going to develop them. All the big companies can't stand the idea of having to switch from their devoted technology of gasoline polluting cars to electric cars. Fighting new information, attacking it. So Tesla comes along because none of the automakers are doing their job. What happens? All the news organizations gang up on Tesla, provide misinformation. deny the story. To do what? To protect their advertisers. Tesla doesn't spend a penny advertising. All of the automakers combined spend billions of dollars. And they all want the story killed that electric cars are the future. So for year after year after year, Tesla is the only competent producer of electric cars. And it is the biggest shorted stock on Wall Street for year after year after year. Doom and gloom for Tesla, no profit for Tesla, it's going to fail, this endless attacks. Even the phenomena most recently in China, where Elon Musk in 11 months breaks ground in a swamp in China to build one of the biggest factories on Earth and start producing one of the best cars ever made, 100% electric, simultaneously gets a license to be the only automaker that is fully US owned in China, get a Chinese tax credit, get support from the Chinese government and exclusion from tariffs, and start producing fully saleable cars 11 months after breaking ground on a swamp. That's Elon Musk. What's covered in all the US news media? His dance moves at the opening of the factory. Funky dance moves, oh, crazy dance moves. The stupidity of misinformation on the news is laughable, is absolutely laughable. But we're asked to take the news seriously. Sexual abuse, genital mutilation, trauma are one of the biggest national crises our culture needs to face to survive. So naturally, in our schools, not a single hour is given to our children or our teenagers on how to spot parental abuse. In the biggest gang in the country, ignorant, addicted, traumatized, abusive parents, the size of giants relative to their infants, left alone without any parental training to reenact their family history in their school. Not a peep. If anything, when you show up at school dissociated, ashamed, terrified, and traumatized, you will be stigmatized with a learning disability. Because surprisingly, when your mom is being beaten up, when your sister is being raped, it's hard to concentrate on see, spot, run. A fictitious dog is not as important to our young children as the abuses at home, suggesting that they may be more intelligent than the cult that is attempting to miseducate them in the bizarre experiment that is our schools. Now, all of this fits within a holographic or a fractal pattern. It's a pattern that spans power structures, that spans time, that permeates Western culture and many other cultures on the planet today. The most important objects in a family system will be hidden from direct verbalization and reenacted within the child-family dynamic. What's the most important object in a family system? Well, how about incest? If it's happened, it has severe impact on the entire family system. So why not talk about it? Dad gets drunk when he learns from his bosses that the measure of him as a man is directly dependent on how much money he makes for the company, and he wasn't willing to lie, he wasn't willing to do this and this. Dad was made to feel small at work, which is part of our capitalist cult. He doesn't know what to do about it in an emotionally illiterate cult that refuses to take a single hour in its entire curriculum to learn the science of feelings and what they mean. He feels small. In an abuse cult, in a chauvinistic cult, he comes home and mom doesn't want to sleep with him unless he's providing a certain amount of money and making her look good, in a world in which her value is determined by how much money her husband brings home. He feels small at work. He feels small because he doesn't know how to deal with those small feelings. He feels small because his wife is prioritizing the abusive opinions of a neighborhood over loving her husband. And he feels small and rejected because he wants to be held, and he feels like a regressed, abused child. And he doesn't feel like a man because he's not getting any sex in a cult that in part values him based on how sexually attractive he is to the opposite sex. So he's made to feel small again. He feels shame. He feels small. He feels terrified. And his daughter, who's 6 years old, makes him feel like a god. And he wants to be with her and feel important the way he doesn't know how to feel anywhere else in this cult. And maybe he could get sexual release in her body at the same time and express some of the hostility and rage he feels at being set up to fail emotionally time after time after time. You see, but this family isn't mature enough and doesn't know how to love enough to deal with this pattern. As 6-year-old little Jenny is asked to step into the cult's insanity because nobody questions the cult. Nobody questions the government. No one questions the neighborhood, and no one questions the family system. If little Jenny does the healthy thing and say, "Why did Dad stick his penis in me?" her mother shushes her and tells her to become invisible, that this is a cult of lies. That must never be said again. Little Jenny grows up and discovers that she is an abuse survivor and that everyone in her family colluded about it because they loved her. She doesn't know what to do with that either, but she naturally feels a bit angry. Do you think this has something to do with the experience in our families? Do you think the cult might be a little saner if this conversation was explained to a 10-year-old? That's why you have no self-esteem. That's why we shut you up when you ask intelligent questions. That's why we give you the schizophrenic message, think, go to school and learn, and shut up and don't talk about that. Make up your mind. Do you want an intelligent child in the house? Or do you want a fucked up idiot like yourselves? I can stay home from the bullying epic that is school if you don't actually want me to think and to learn. Make up your minds. We want you to get an A at school, and we want you to be dumb and ignorant at home and tell lies. Okay? I think I can pull that off if I start drinking. And don't worry, I will pretend I don't drink because I know how much this family values its lies. So, got that one covered. The greatest governmental abuses of power are relabeled and buried in a similar schizophrenia. The very idea of trauma and PTSD is forgotten by one cult after another. Bessel van der Kolk, in his landmark book, The Body Keeps the Score, tracks the progress of understanding trauma and forgetting it, from the Greeks to the current day. Most recently, in World War I and in World War II, the British government went to great lengths to punish all scientists for acknowledging the reality of PTSD. Because if you acknowledge the reality of the abuse, then you acknowledge the abuser, a military system who will induce a biological disease in its men, and then unleash that disease on the children and wives of that men without healing or medicinal repair, and then arrest those men for violating the laws, including pain management control in the form of addiction and dissociation involving drugs, which they will again be arrested for, in the misuse of language that is called a war on people in pain as opposed to a war on drugs. Dating partners in an abuse cult are in a massive level of denial. I have asked just about every dating partner on a first or second date, tell me why you're not in a relationship. Tell me what you didn't like about the men who came before me. Tell me about the abuse. Tell me about the patterns you want to change that have been present in the relationships before me. And in a cult of denial, this is a shocking request. What do you mean? You want to know the truth? You want to see me as I am? You want to acknowledge that the past has impact on the present and on the future? I'm not sure I'm up for that. 98% of our women, I know this because I've had thousands of introductory conversations seeking truth tellers. 98% of our women wince or go into a dissociative denial pattern. I'm done with that. I'm a new person. Really? Really? Recurring traumatic patterns in life just vanish because you met me, I see. I'm a new person. I'm done with that. Or they tell me that I'm a new person. Dane, you're a wonderful man. I am sure you have nothing in common with my ex-boyfriend. Oh, really? I see. Well, tell me about your ex-boyfriend. Well, he was so controlling. Oh, that's very interesting. You know what? In a trauma-based fear environment, I get controlling as well. In fact, my last 3 girlfriends told me that I was controlling. Carry on. well, I don't, he was differently controlling than you are. Yeah, this is a first date. Carry on. Let's see how far the denial goes. And to a woman, the majority of these first dates, when faced with dealing with truth that has little to do with them or me, patterns repeat until they become conscious, and a force equal or greater absorbs the momentum of the pattern, and a new pattern is formed that allows for survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem more effectively than the old pattern, and you master the technology of adopting the new pattern. How about that? A little bit of scientific data. Not welcome. Not romantic enough. The greatest trauma of my life is given to me by a healer, a therapist, a facilitator at the Human Awareness Institute, a teacher on healthy relationships. After I've gone through $150,000 of therapies and healings, none of which mentioned trauma. 40 healing practitioners in a cult where undiagnosed, misunderstood, and compounded trauma is the leading underlying cause. Between abuses, between addictions, between insanity, and compulsive reenaction of stupid behavior that gets us through the day. Not good enough for these 40 therapists and healers, though. Let's do some visualization. Tell me about your feelings of the week. Let's talk about everything but the major underlying cause, so that when your therapist sexually abuses you under the influence of psychedelics, you won't have a clue what's going on or where to go for help. Because that's the kind of thing we do in this culture of denial and avoidance of truth. I bring it to the Human Awareness Institute. Sexual abuse by a high participant with a client, by a high facilitator, is not a high issue. Their issue is ensuring that the entire world wins. Sexual abuse by a priest, not an issue for the Vatican. Their issue is sowing and seeding the world with the truth of God's knowledge. That homosexuals are damned, that women have no place in the culture. A mathematical anomaly. All of these important men are more important than the mothers that made their life possible. A little bit of a mathematical tongue twister, isn't it? How do you go about proving that the golden egg is more valuable than the goose that lays the golden egg? How do you prove that scientifically? You don't. It's poppycock. It's bullshit. One more on the list. It doesn't add up. That's why you have cult dogma. That's why you have stupidity. That's why you have men in power who just write down shit and say, this is the way it's going to be. Screw the science, and we'll use superior mass, violence, and intimidation to steamroll our agenda through. We'll use science when it suits us. Thank you, Einstein, for nuclear weapons. Now we can enforce our cult dogma with superior technology. We can allow superior technology to be in service to inferior technology. our stupidity to kill millions of people. No doubt it would have been a war on terror as well, an unnecessary phenomena. The Japanese were willing to surrender and were no longer a threat. But wouldn't it be nice to let the world know the kind of country we are, and that we've got our hands on a weapon that we can drop on innocent civilians anytime we want? It's wonderful. Being a sociopathic white man in a military-industrial complex, in a schizophrenic cult that will look the other way anytime we apply our principles on the terrifying unknown that we call enemy. It's not surprising in the context of our schizophrenia that I was banned from posting on the email lists at the Human Awareness Institute once it became known that I refused to abide by the secrecy protocol of the facilitators anytime a sexual abuse happens between a facilitator and a client. Meaning the high email lists say that you cannot post more than X amount of words, you cannot do business things more than this amount of time, you have to respect the general intent of the list for community this, and we're here to promote a world where everyone wins. But there's an unspoken clause. And the clause says, if you are a sexual traumatic abuse survivor of the high facilitators in the Human Awareness Institute and have evidence of such abuse on a 10-hour recording and have notified us and we do not want to deal with it, but you threaten to bring human awareness to our community, we will ban you from the support of your community, because that's the kind of assholes we are when you are at your most vulnerable and our secret is threatened. We love to talk about freedom of the press as long as we can get our CIA operatives into every major news organization and quell the story. The New York Times could have told Edward Snowden's story a few years earlier, but a personal call with the president and vice president, right, was enough to kill that story. So WikiLeaks told the story of the truth and has been hated. And enormous efforts go to make this hatred of the truth noble. No, this is not attacking freedom of the press. WikiLeaks is not a news organization. We write the news and tell our news what they should be saying. No, those are news organizations that tell the things that we want them to tell. It is a foreign intelligence agency. It is a global foreign intelligence agency. Okay, so it's actually intelligent. It's more intelligent than the news. Yes, well, maybe. But we do not protect foreign intelligence agencies because they're intelligent. We've got to kill them. We've got to kill them. How much law-bending and abuse of power needs to go on before we can break the spirit of Julian Assange and drag him out of political asylum in violation of every ethic and doctrine in the United Nations, freedom of the press, because he told us the truth. Can the story be killed by killing off the individuals who fail to let go of the things we need to know to succeed and be competent in our lives? So why is it this resistance to truth? Resistance to truth equals resistance to change. Resistance to truth equals fear of change. When the truth brings in new data that does not fit into the prevailing paradigm, the prevailing dogma. Fear of change is equal to fear of the unknown, because with all change, there is vulnerability to a possibility field that is bigger than the human brain can comprehend. Who knew that invading Iraq would greatly boost the terrorists signing up to fight American imperialism? Who knew that we were strengthening Al-Qaeda by giving 1 million Iraqis PTSD and spending $1 trillion of our children's money? Somewhat predictable, but how do you know for sure? In a probability field that is so complex, where there are so many variables, that sometimes things seem to happen for no particular reason. Fear of change is equal to fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown correlates with an instinctive and visceral awareness that the world is more complex than we understand, and sometimes when we do the right thing for the right reasons, the wrong things happen for reasons we couldn't possibly have figured out. With severely traumatic histories, where many of us are in the first 3 basic levels of human need: survival, security, love, and belonging. Many of us are in survival. Some of us are in security but have no sense of love and belonging. Some have love and belonging but no sense of true security, because the people with whom we are in close relationships with have no survival security either. When you do not have your basic human needs, survival, security, love, and belonging, met with competency, you are verging on a traumatic state, or you are in trauma. When you are in trauma, you are terrified of the unknown. You are overwhelmed. You are flooded with information, and the last thing you want is to realize you may not know what's going on. You may have a faulty map of reality. Your country may not be the best thing since sliced bread. Your shiny new date may be a reenactment of all the horrors you've run so far to get away from. Your new husband may be the abusive father you cannot face. I don't want to know that, because I don't know how to deal with a pattern that is more complex than my brain can comprehend in a traumatically illiterate, culturally illiterate, emotionally illiterate, relationally illiterate cult, in which I have not received a single hour of competent scientific education in some of the most important domains of daily life. And in a cult that cannot admit it was wrong, because it's a shame cult, because it's a blame cult, because it's an abuse cult. And to admit that something was wrong does not lead intelligently to how can we make it right and work together with that. It leads to who's to blame, who should be punished, while pathologically ignoring the need to change. because we do not want to face the unknown, because we're terrified of the repressed, overwhelming emotions of an abuse cult that we don't know how to deal with in the past. And whenever a pattern in the past is unacknowledged, denied, lied about, turned into insanity, it gets projected into the future. And the future is in the unknown. A cult that is traumatically illiterate will fight the unknown to the death, destroying itself, as many of the 10,000 cults in human history have done so, destroying themselves, rather than face the terror, the humility, the vulnerability of uncertainty, the uncertainty that is ushered in by truth, the change that is ushered in by new information. New information, and those bearing it, will be excluded, ostracized, shamed, humiliated, made light of, deflected, spun, cross-labeled, turned into its opposite, with a pathological regularity of a machine of ignorance and terror, until we face the pain, trauma, and grief of our childhood abuses in an emotionally and traumatically illiterate cult without adults who will put the sanity and interest of the child above their need to hide from the projected punishment that is part of every ignorant cult. Because when we don't have the technology to heal, when we don't have the technology to respond, and we are terrified of change, of the unknown, what we are really punishing both the victim and the abuser for, because both are punished in a cult that buries them in a grave of denial, 8 levels of lies, and then paves the thing over with an asphalt parking lot. The abuser and the victim are both buried in cults that do not acknowledge their reality and how they produce them systematically and predictably over time. Every cult, in punishing its abuser and punishing its victim, is punishing the anomalous data that says, ding, 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 ding. Hello, shame-based, ignorant abuse cult. Hello, hello. This is your friendly truth teller calling you. You may not have figured it all out yet. No, it's happened to 9,999 cults in human history, according to anthropologists. No, they didn't figure it out either. That's why they're dead. That's why the root word for culture is cult. It's never been data-based. No, cults do what they do and are perpetuated by terrified people who want a set of status quos so they don't think. Yeah, the trouble is that no one's going to cling to you if you change too quickly. The whole purpose of a cult is to freeze a moment in time. You're willing to die with the other cults rather than tell the truth? Okay, well, you join the silent majority of dead cults in that protocol, so it is predictable. No, we won't tell anyone. Yes, of course, everyone in the future will look back and think how stupid everything we're doing today is, just like every other cult in human history. But you will be dead, so you won't have to feel any embarrassment. Yes, the abuses will continue. Hello? Too much truth-telling for that cult. The pattern continues. It has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with me, except as long as each of us chooses to be traumatically illiterate, relationally illiterate, emotionally illiterate, culturally illiterate. As long as we choose not to face chauvinism, PTSD, and the reenactment of sociopathic cruelty from the giants in our lives towards the small parts of our lives, we will be terrified of the unknown, and consciously or unconsciously, we will cling to the familiar. And the familiar status quo mandated by our cult is a lie. It has always been a lie. Every cult in human history perpetuates lies that reassure people in their common repetition, that provide a simple version of reality, that means we don't have to think, which means we don't have to respond, which means that the future won't be all that much more intelligent than the past. And we will hold to the abusive patterns of our childhood, clinging to that which is most familiar, the identity of the trauma survivor, the identity of the abuser. That which is suppressed and denied and kept secret always defines us, because by keeping something secret, by refusing to talk about it, we communicate that it is too big for us. That's the only reason to entertain a secret. It takes energy and it creates problems to keep a secret. We do it because we tell ourselves that the secret threatens the status quo. We tell ourselves that we are not big enough to face the change and the future and the chaos of uncertainty that will be unleashed by telling the truth. In doing so, we reinforce a faulty belief, which is that we are smaller than our abuses, smaller than change, and smaller than the traumatic history of our childhood. That belief that we are smaller and cannot confront who we are and deal with the truth makes us afraid of the truth, and we will elect governments and power structures who will protect us from the parts of ourselves we are afraid of, those truths inside that we lack the competency, the love, the dignity, and the intelligence to integrate.